Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show the author of probably one of the best books I have read in years, Dr Monica Gagliano. Dr Gagliano is an evolutionary ecologist with a background in both marine ecology and plant cognition. The book in question, Thus Spoke the Plant, details her journey combining some of the most fascinating experiments into, I guess, the extent of plant intelligence you are likely to encounter, as well as her experience learning with and from both indigenous teachers and plant spirits themselves. Before we begin, because this is the Mercury retrograde to end all Mercury retrogrades, we had some audio challenges during the call. As ever, I did my absolute best to tidy it up. It's definitely worth persisting through the minor inconveniences. Anyway, onwards. Dr. Gagliano, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me, Gordon.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to this chat. Your book, I think, is one of the best books I've read in years. I absolutely loved it. And a big shout out to friend of the show and actual friend Jay Springett for recommending it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I have lots of questions.
Thank you.
And lots of questions, Monica, but what we do with our first-time guests, we have a traditional first question before we get to the book, which is, Monica, were you a weird kid?
Well, are they normal kids anyway?
That's a good point.
I think we are all a bit weird, right?
Yeah.
It's just that, we get taught to be normal, and that's when we get really weird.
That's true. Was that your experience growing up?
Well, this is what I've learned through my life up to this point. I mean, I think I was a normal kid. I thought I was normal. And but my parents, like many parents, probably thought I wasn't. And I conformed pretty happily with the educational system. And so I did my schooling and I went to university, got all my pieces of paper and, all the qualifications. And I had a very great time really learning, and I love learning. So I think that university for me in particular was a really good space because I think that's why we go to university. And then on the way, of course, I learned even more directly by engaging in my research, and this time the teachers were not necessarily humans anymore, but it became, anything I worked with really, whether I was trained as a marine ecologist, so much of my initial work was done in the marine environment, and in particular with coral reef fishes, and they became a very good teacher, and then of course I moved on to plants, and they certainly had plenty to teach me. So I guess if that is weird, well then I'm weird. But to me, curiosity and wanting to learn always seems a pretty normal trait of a human being.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I suppose, because you did become a professional researcher and academic, that you must have enjoyed school, but I was wondering if you were the kid who would sneak away and be found in the woods when you were 3 or 4 years old, given how your life turned out. I was just thinking maybe she would leave school and go and play in the woods or something. But I guess if you are going to become a professional researcher, you have to like school.
Yeah, and I really did, because actually my upbringing was much less idyllic than that. I lived in a very suburban area and in Italy, and And my parents were definitely not interested in nature. And my mom thought nature was something that you keep well outside the door, and because it's dirty and you don't bring it inside. So my excursions into nature really were the park that was down the road, which was actually an amazing, big, huge park. And it had a lot of trees. And so, yeah, I would get in trouble for getting home late because I stayed at the park longer and played and hidden in the bushes and then, climbing over things. But it wasn't, it was all quite manicured and cultivated, I guess, compared to a wild forest. I wish, but maybe I wouldn't have turned out this way.
Well, exactly.
So it's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You mentioned the story in the book and you just kind of referenced it there, but how did you come to study plants? Because we do sort of have, as you say, the Great Barrier Reef to thank for it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as you just mentioned, I did tell the story in the book, and it took me actually about 10 years to be able to share that story. And the first time I did was in an academic environment, and I was invited to talk about the marine environment and the crisis of, the climate as we know it these days. And this was a meeting primarily composed of academics from the humanities. And maybe for that reason, I felt a bit safer to expose myself, I guess, in something that it felt very intimate, because the experience that I had in the marine environment, as you hinted, changed my entire career. And because of the experience that I had with my fish, I understood that what I was doing wasn't quite right. And I turned to plants almost like, there's two things. On one side, I turned to plants because I didn't know what to do to continue my research without doing it the way in which I was doing it, which is what much of research is done anyway. And involved, of course, the humanely sacrificing your object of study. While my fish obviously taught me that they were not objects at all, they were subjects, and they were not the subject of my study, and so they were not very prepared to be humanely sacrificed, but were very interested in knowing who I was and interacting with me and letting me know who they were. And so when that happened, of course, I entered into a bit of a crisis, and I turned onto plants because I just started gardening. But also, I often feel that when I think back, I think plants actually saved the scientist that was in me, because at that point, I think I really considered maybe I'm not cut out for science. I can't do science like this, and maybe I need to think of something else. I tried, but it didn't quite work, and it turns out that maybe I had some more things to do in science. And,
well, yeah,
it's my work.
Yeah, you weren't wrong. Science was wrong. Like there are other ways of learning other than just destroying the thing that you're trying to learn from, not about. And I think the plants taught you that. And so science is wrong, and you're right, Monica. But
that was just how I needed to learn, I guess. I'm sure many others get to the same point in other ways. It's just maybe I was really stubborn and I needed to have a very drastic experience to make me see, okay, no more of these and let's find something else. So that's what happened, basically. So then I entered in the realm of plants, not as a botanist or anything, but as an animal behavioral ecologist, and not even like a terrestrial one, but an aquatic one, a marine one. And really, still now, I know nothing about plants. In terms of like, as an academic, I'm not a plant physiologist, I'm not a botanist, I don't know the names. And I really, honestly, have very little interest in learning that. Not because I don't appreciate that kind of knowledge, but it is because I appreciate what that knowledge can do when it's used properly, but also what it can do when it's just used blindly. And I don't want to be blind anymore, because that's what happened with my other work with my animals, my fish. And so I rather know less and learn more. than the other way around.
Well, and I'm going to ask you these questions because you cover it a little bit in the book as well. If the existing system yielded the knowledge that we know is out there, then you should have to learn it. But the fact is, it doesn't. So it's kind of okay that you found other ways of getting this information. And that's like one of the things I like about the book. And this is a hard question, and you'll appreciate why it's a trick question. But Monica, what is a plant? Like, how do we define a plant?
This is a hard question, but only because it depends who is answering. So if I answer as the scientist, I would probably have to start describing a plant as, the kind of cells that the plant is made of, that is they're very specific to plants, and they've got very rigid walls, those cells, while the animal cells are very different, and they are softy, and plants grow differently than animals do, and I will naturally end up in this comparison between what plants are compared to others. And often these others are the animals, and often these others are already considered better than the plant. So it just invites a particular discourse. And so if I don't know anything about plants, then I can't really describe them very well that way. But I can describe them in the way in which I encountered plants in my own professional as well as personal experience. And so I can describe them just as any other living being that is around us. Plants are very much living, and they have their own agenda, their own ideas. And this is, of course, a tricky word to use, but they have their own minds about what is their life about, and what do they want, and what are they after. And they're not just dumb mechanical responses. What they engage to engage with life and thrive, but not only thrive. They take over the world. And thanks God they do, because otherwise nobody else will be here. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's how we categorize them. I mean, it's not that you can't accurately describe cells and all that, and, cellulose content and all this kind of stuff. It's not that that's not there. It's that there's a quote from your book. It is through this reductionist approach that the subjective plant, made of raw, vibrant, living flesh, has been dismembered, discarnated, and substituted with a lackluster abstraction, the scientific idea of what a plant is, does, and knows. And that's kind of the crux of the book, is the existing or accepted scientific procedures, which are a small subset of how we can learn about the world, can only give us a mechanical view, because we sort of invent the plant in our heads and then think that's the plant, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. And that's it. Like, thank you for reading back at me what I apparently wrote, because I don't really remember much. People keep doing this. It's like, and you wrote this. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's right.
And it sounds good. Yeah. It sounds really... I have the same thing.
That sounds good.
I have the same thing when people read back my books. I'm like, wow, that sounds really good. Who wrote that? Oh.
Yeah, who wrote that? But that's exactly how it feels to me. It feels like... and this actually for plants in a way is even worse than with animals. In animal studies, at least we are quite aware that the animal is alive and kicking and he's got his own agendas, because they let us know very quickly. They'll bite you, or they'll do things that will let you know, no, I'm not happy about this. Plants, because they, as you well know, and everyone is quite aware of this, is that they live in a very different time scale, and their reactions are very different. And so we are not so prone to see them as subject in their own life, but we see them more like a pretty object that make life green. But and in science, especially in the sort of molecular aspect of plant science, but physiologists do that to some extent as well. They talk about the molecules, they talk about the cells, they talk about the genes, they talk about the proteins, and they're like tons and tons of absolutely boring and absolutely incomprehensible papers written about these little details, which don't really, what are they going to tell us about the plant as the entity as a whole? nothing really. They just tell us about that protein in that plant, which then turns out that we might find it somewhere else. And oh, look, it's the same protein doing the same thing. Proteins don't do things like genes don't do things. The organism does things. And, that's to me the big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so one of my favorite anthropologists, Tim Ingold, says the environment doesn't exist, and it's what you're saying. Like you invent these abstractions, and then you mistake that for reality. It's a very Gnostic error, I think, and it doesn't mean that life doesn't exist or plants or animals don't exist. It's that we've invented the environment as this collection of ideas, and we're kind of missing it.
Yeah, and also that goes hand in hand with another quote from John Muir, no, it wasn't him, someone else, where we look out at the environment and all of these objects in the environment, while there are no such a things as objects, they are only subjects, and the environment doesn't exist because we are all subject interacting. So it's this relational space that then from which what we call environment emerges to me. And so I see the plant as just another side of when I look at a plant or when I interact with an animal or when I interact with a human, actually, it doesn't really matter. To me, I see the other as part of this emergence, this space of relating, which will bring me to life as well in that moment, because in that moment I become the Monica that is in that moment interacting with this other of whatever nature. And as you know, some people bring the best out of you, some people bring the worst out of you. And well, if you were just you, why would you change depending on who you are interacting with? Because I think that you're not you as just you. You are you in relation to everything else, and that includes literally everybody else.
Yeah, well said, definitely. One of the things that I think is so remarkable about the book is that it is written by a scientist and describes, which we're going to talk about, actual scientific experiments, but it's also this deeply personal journey that's also really, really well written. So maybe tell us about your first psychedelic experience. Did you get to do that as a teenager, or was it all in the context of this journey to becoming aware of plant people and that kind of stuff?
Well, actually, one thing that I didn't really explore as a teenager, and I had really no interest whatsoever, was psychedelic drugs in general. And not because I was a goody-goody, it's just I didn't really care. I was just not interested. And so I didn't come to this because I have a background of exploring, altered states or because I like drugs or whatever, which I have to say I have encountered obviously many people involved in this kind of exploration, I would say. And there is a tendency, I have to say, I've noted that a lot of people attracted to this kind of work do also have a history with drugs of some kind. So then there is a risk that this becomes just yet another of the same experiences where you just want to not be here. You're not really wanting to learn to be here, which is what, to me, is the point of these openings that the psychedelics in particular allow you to appreciate, so that you can be more here, more fully here. And instead, I see that often these are used, just like many other drugs, as a form of escapism. So you don't want to be here, and you're using them to get out, and which is fine. It's not a judgment. It's just like my approach to these didn't come from that perspective. It came from I don't really know where it came from. Actually, I think it just called me in, and when I stopped working with the fish and kind of turned to the plants, all of it came all at once. So I never considered in my life to discover or to explore ayahuasca, for example. And then suddenly there it was. The invitation was there, and it was more than an invitation. It was like you have no choice. You have to go through this door. And I'm like, oh dear, okay. But what really characterized my encounter with this particular psychedelic medicine is the fact that I had no fear whatsoever. Sometimes before you have a different experience, you might be very anxious or very like, oh my God, what am I doing? And what if I lose it? And instead, I always had a real deep sense of calm that this was my path and I was going to walk into it with both feet. And but of course, there was a lot of disruption at the time in my overall life, both professionally and personally. So it had just arrived at that perfect time when I was changing everything. And so it just felt like totally natural that I would embark into that exploration. And then I guess it hasn't stopped.
No, there's a couple of points in the book where it's become eerily apparent that you were kind of summoned to do this work, like if it called you, and even just improbable moments of getting funding, which, where you're actually in Australia, which means we're in the same time zone. Hooray for me and my guest. But the improbability of getting some of that early funding as you were moving, from the ocean to green things, all these little moments that make it look like that kind of increase your awareness that whatever a plant actually is, going back to that question, yes, the physical expression of them is an animate person with intentionality and all this, but some of them can play a very long and tricksy game by the looks of it.
Oh yeah, and that's the thing. Is like I am always very aware, and I know, especially actually, this is true everywhere worldwide. There is this renaissance of psychedelic, for example, and Michael Pollan just wrote an entire book, kind of retracing the foundations and all of that, and I guess I am even more watchful of where I put myself, because I'm very aware, and the plants have told me very clearly that not all of them are for me to engage with, and so I don't. And again, in this case, I'm very selective, because I know that if I wanted to, the opportunity to explore pretty much anything are there. But the question for me is always why. Why is this arriving to me, and is it me, like my own egotistical drive that wants to try things and whatever? And I don't really have that, so like it's literally not too much in my nature. So I don't really operate that way. I don't really have an addictive personality, so that is it's good. So I can easily say no, and I don't really care. But when it's a yes, then I have no choice. And so I'm just watching how this resurgence of the psychedelics is happening around the world, but especially in the West, where I think that probably we really needed to crack their head open. But it comes with, as always, because we're talking about humans really more than plants, the plants will do what they need to do. And sometimes the idea is just like, can the human do what the human needs to do? And I think that some of these plants are there to take some people for a ride, exactly to show them, I'm taking you for a ride. Can you see that? I'm taking you for a ride. Are you realizing that? And because it's the same kind of attention, is the same kind of awareness that is required, I think, to realize what's happening in general around you all the time. And of course, as we know, the majority of humanity at the moment is not really seeing very clearly what's happening around, but is improving very fast. And I think the plants, to me, are having this resurgence. And even in science, there is a huge movement now of like plant studies and trying to work out what plants choose, and people that criticize some of the early work on, even the bioacoustics, for example, now are publishing big papers and showing like, oh, look what I found, which is awesome. And that is actually, to me, the biggest compliment that I could ever receive for my work, because someone that criticized and then went off and did it themselves and found exactly the same or even better, that it's incredible, and that's great. And I think that the plants have their own agenda, and they are putting it in place. And my feeling is that they are locating those individuals who are in specific places where they can make some leverage on the situation, so that they can deliver their message in a way that reaches as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, because we need to move relatively fast now. And it's ironical, of course, the plants would be so slow to our eyes.
Yeah.
And yet they're the one to speed us up now.
Yes, but if you move slow, you can think fast. I mean, some of the stories in that book, they're exactly. Sort of 3 moves ahead of you every time when it comes to funding and moving around. It's just the kind of thing that if you've been alive for 120 years, you've had some practice. Yeah, exactly. So I'm glad we spoke about the psychedelics, because one of the things I especially loved about this book, being interested in ethnobotany and psychedelics and so on, is when we talk about plant communication or engaging with spirits of plants, our first thought is, Carpi and psilocybin, which isn't a plant, but you go with me on this. Yep. But that's not the only, there are methodologies that can be used to interact with psychoactive plants, but they don't necessarily have to be psychoactive on a molecular level. And what I really loved about this book is, Monica, if you would tell us what a dieta is and how that helps us understand plants, or have plants teach us.
Yeah, so the dieta, of course, is a process that has been carried out for a very long time, and it comes from South America. But the dieta, in itself as a process, not called that way, but done anyway, you can find it in other places. And I suspect that this was the same approach that we had as Europeans, before we burn all of our herbalists at the stake. But so I guess in the context of the dieta, it's a process of isolation primarily. And isolation means isolation from the world outside, but also isolation of the senses. So you have a very, very, very boring diet. So literally the food that you eat is very boring. There is no salt, no sugar. It's very plain and very insipid, because the idea is that you want to stay as neutral as possible with the intake of other plants, because that's what your food is mostly, and so that you can literally listen to the one that you are working with. And so while you maintain this quite blunt diet, and you are in isolation, and you abstain from any interaction, sexual or non-sexual, of any kind, basically, you basically sit there and wait, and your mind will arrive first. And you will start thinking that you can't do this, and this is going to drive you crazy, and all of this stuff. But if you had a little bit of experience with meditation, you will know that this is normal. And then after a while, your mind will quiet down. And when there is silence, you can really hear a lot. And that's when the plants that you might be working with, which is your teacher in that moment for that dieta, will come in and literally explain what it's for, whether it's medicinal or for other purposes. It can be just like emotional or all sorts of things. And in my case, and I'm sure that it's not just my case, but in my case, some of the plants told me exactly how to design the experiments that I did. And I'm talking about a plant in particular, which is called Aya Uma, and that's the sort of Quechua name. The moniker in English is cannonball tree, because of the type of fruit that this tree produces, and they look like cannonballs. And when they come down, they smash on the ground and they sound really loud. And like a cannonball. So, and in this case, for example, the ayahuasca, I don't think is considered a psychedelic plant per se. And I didn't use any other plants while I was dieting with the ayahuasca. But I had such a clear and unmistakable conversation with her for days on end. And so the dieta sometimes involves ayahuasca, just because the ayahuasca, which is known in South America as the pintorera, and la pintorera is the painter. So ayahuasca is used sometimes during the dieta process to allow the person that is dieting to see clearer what the other plants, the actual maestra plant, the teacher is trying to show. But sometimes it's not required because the teacher is so good and is so clear by itself that you don't need to ask for help. So it's a process that allow for this direct communication and direct exchange. And sometimes it's mediated by ayahuasca, and sometimes it's not required. And but either way, it's an amazing. It's not for everyone, because it's very demanding on the body and on the mind, but it's absolutely remarkable, the closeness and the richness of knowledge, and also the generosity. Plants are just so happy to share, and they know, and this is one of the things that I try to convey in the book, because it was an experience that I had over and over again. They know exactly what we need, even when we don't know that we need that, and they deliver it. And then you kind of realize in hindsight that, oh, that's exactly what I need, and I know. Well, so I'm very fond.
Oh, look! I mean, I asked. It was quite clear in the book that the dieta is like is a process, or almost like a. It's almost like its own scientific method. Like it is a structure in which you can encounter in the clearest way possible a particular plant spirit that you'll be working with. And I think in a way, I mean, the story is just astounding. You're almost underselling it. So you were alone in the jungle eating rice, talking to a tree that told you to design an experiment using peas back in Australia, and you went and did this. And not just that, the tree got it right and you got it wrong initially. Like this is how good they are at conveying this information. It's the most amazing story.
Yeah, because I was trying to do the experiment with sunflowers, and I had a totally different setup. I mean, the setup looked good, and it looked like, from a human mind perspective, it looked like surely this is going to work and it's going to work well, but it wasn't. And so I left it like, I really like to test this idea that plants can learn like the Pavlov's dog. And I think my gut feeling, and this is something that, it's allowed in science, even if we don't talk about it. We do have these hunches and these gut feelings. And so I think this is possible. At least it's possible to test this. It's just I need to find the right way to test it. And then when I went to the jungle, I wasn't really thinking about this at all. And it's funny because ayahuasca is a plant that it's very about. Some people describe the spirits as a big human shaped with no head, and the ayahuasca works on the brain and on the mind. So it's funny that it would go straight there, and it would just change my mind about to do my experiment. It's like, first of all, no peas, no sunflowers, peas. And I was like, oh, okay. And then next thing I know, I'm drawing the entire setup on my diary, and the size of pipes that we used to build this thing. And it was like, okay. And then, as you know, because you read the book, I went back and I did set it up and run it. And after 2 weeks, I thought, I'm an idiot. I mean, this is not really working. And I thought that I was going to listen to some tree in the middle of the jungle, and the tree would tell me what to do about my science. I'm seriously, I lost it here. And so I went in to dismantle everything. And I remember it was a Sunday afternoon, because during that day there was hardly anybody on campus. And And I went in, and then there was something that stopped me because I was about to turn all the lights on because the experiment was done in the dark, and just like, wrap everything up. And instead I was like, just wait. And I don't know what it was that got me to wait and just have another look. And when I did, I saw something that I couldn't see until that moment. And I think, again, in this case, there were multiple plants involved in the process of creating. And the construction of knowledge is not just by me. It's totally a collaboration. And of course, there was the Ayauma, which I think it was back there. I could feel it, like I knew it. You couldn't see it, but I knew it. And then, of course, the P's that were involved in the actual experiment, which were like, we can do this. And amazing. And to me, if I need to spend so much time of my life doing this kind of work, I couldn't wish to have better companions.
Yeah, see, this I find this interesting from a scientific publication perspective, because I know in anthropological circles you basically listed co-authors of your experiment. There's the tree in the jungle, and there's the actual piece. It wasn't just you doing it, and we're actually. This is one of those situations where science is currently configured can't get at a truth beyond itself, because you can't publish like that. And I know in anthropology they want to be able to footnote a cloud or a mountain, and you can't, because you have to footnote someone else's paper that's written by humans. You actually can't use the system as it is to teach the system that it has some shortcomings. And I find that infinitely really fascinating.
Yeah, and of course, as you know, this book was actually commissioned by the plants, and he arrived. The time to write it arrived once I finished all the work in the scientific literature, and because of course the scientific method is a method, and I can apply because I've been trained very well to do so, and so that's got no problems. And once all of those papers were kind of secured in the academic archive, then suddenly, the plants were like, well, the book. And I was like, no, we're not telling these stories. And they were like, you have to, because this is part of your work. This is part of the kind of science that you're in. And otherwise, we're just playing hide and seek. And I'm like, I'd rather hide. And he's like, but you're a seeker, so stop hiding. And so the book came with a bit of reluctance at the beginning. And then once okay, let's do this, I engaged with the process. All of these plants that were there, that had been there in my journey from the beginning, they all arrived and they were all present. So whenever I wrote a chapter, we were of course written in total order, because there's like, now we're going to write chapter 5, and then let's go to 2, and so. But the plants were literally still co-authoring this, because the Socoba plants, which was the first plant that I really dieted in the Amazon, that chapter almost was written last, and when the plant was ready to arrive, I knew it was time, and I managed to understand some of the things that she shared at the time, which I have written in the diary, which made no sense whatsoever to me at that time, until that night when she woke me up and said, okay, now we're writing this. And then things started making sense in a way that I didn't realize, which also allowed me, and I took the liberty to let some of the things in this book unclear. They're unclear to me. Maybe they make sense to others, and maybe it's not for me to understand some of the meanings for plants shared. Or maybe I'm not ready quite to see what I need to see, and so it requires a little bit more maturing before I can understand what they really shared. And because I learned that I can't really throw away anything, because whatever they shared through time has always in the end worked out to have a very deep and meaningful sense, then I'm just going to leave it there and allow it for it to, germinate when it's time.
Yeah, exactly. Like the seed bank in the soil. But I'm quite sure there are bits, if they don't make sense now, they will make sense now that the book exists. It'll be another repeat of that. Ah, that's what that meant a few years' time.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why it's such a joy to read, because it is for me an example of exactly the kind of scientific works that I want, which you're in it, and you actually rigorously describe the existing scientific process, but the plants are in it. But it's that absolute mix of your experience and the input of human and non-human people, and all in a completely coherent, this is the thing that happened, these are my experiments way. It's absolutely the kind of, the plants were right. This is the sort of book that I think that needs to exist if we're going to, open up more space for this kind of research, I think.
Yeah, totally. And actually, it's been really interesting because, of course, most of the comments that I get from people are obviously positive. Obviously, I say no because the book is so good, but because I think that people generally are more prone to share how good the thing is when they feel good. And those ones that didn't like it, I don't know about them because they don't speak much. But of course, there are some of those that do actually that this didn't make any sense, so this was just blah blah, and there I find it even more useful to me as a feedback, because it just reminds me exactly where humanity is. Where are we at with this, and with this connecting with ourselves, really, through the other, in this case a plant or whatever, and ourselves, I mean not the small self of the human, but the self that to me is, I don't know, some people might call it consciousness or life or whatever. And so those, when I receive feedback that didn't make any sense whatsoever, it just reminds me of where I was. And so it reminds me that, this is actually exactly for you. And it might not make sense now, and maybe it will never make sense. Maybe you'll have to come back another life to do it.
Yeah.
But at least you are telling me that this is actually landing in the right place. Because if it didn't do anything at all, then I would be concerned. But the plant told me that, don't worry. The book will arrive and will do exactly what it needs to do, where it needs to do it at the time when it's ready. And so I just needed to kind of author it or co-author it. And then the rest is none of my business.
Yeah, well, you have the fingers, so you have to do the typing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, look, you are better at this, and we don't know how this computer stuff works. So could you? I
did. There's some of the experiments in the book are on their own book, right? But there's one that I just think just blew my mind. So, and it's the mimosa question, Monica. Do plants have memories?
Yeah, of course they do. And Mimosa was, she's a smarty one, in the sense that the way in which this plant behaves, of course, is very much is matching our time scale. So it's very obvious to us that this plant is actually doing something. And this is, of course, the plant closes the leaves when it's disturbed and all of that. But the experiment, of course, was about whether Mimosa was able to recognize there's something that was maybe a little bit annoying. Like in my case, in the experiment, I was literally dropping them with gravity, control dropped. And as I always say, no plants were, disrupted and no plants died, and nobody was hurt really in the process of these experiments. But with Mimosa, basically, the idea was, can Mimosa learn that something is really annoying and it looks scary or feels scary at the beginning when you don't really know what it is? Can the plant learn to recognize, actually, there are no consequences to this, and I can just relax? So Mimosa, of course, closes the leaves when it's disturbed, because it's part of a anti-predatory, it's a defense mechanism. So it's an anti-predatory strategy to look smaller, to look less appetizing. And then when it closes the leaves, usually you can see the thorns. So maybe it looks like worthwhile. And so, but the problem with that strategy, well, it's not a problem if you're doing it when it's really appropriate, when there is danger. But if you do it when the danger is not real, like in the case of my study, then every time you close your leaves unnecessarily, what you're really doing is you're cutting off almost half of the amount of light that you can feed on. And so your photosynthetic efficiency drops, I think, down to 40% or something like that. So it's...
and it also takes a lot of energy to do, right? So it's not just that they don't get... Yep. You just think of a little plant closing its leaves, but they don't generally do that. That's a big sort of energy expenditure as well, yep. Whilst at the same time reducing photosynthesis. So it's a big decision to make.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, if you are trying to protect yourself, if you're trying to close your leaves for your life, then it's a great decision, and then you catch up later maybe. But if you're doing it and there is no threat, then you're really not smart. And so in all other systems where we have looked at this kind of behavior, non-plant systems, every single time we find that animals can do this. We do it too. We start to ignore things that are not important in our environment just because we know that there is no consequences there. But if you are sitting at your desk and then suddenly the fire alarm goes off, then your system is ready to go. So this is the technical term for this kind of behavior, which is a non-associative. So you don't have to associate one cue with another cue to learn anything. It's just like to know from experience that, I've seen this before and I can safely ignore it until the environment tells me otherwise. And so Mimosa learns very quickly that the drop that I was inflicting was actually annoying. And probably like, I can't wait for this woman to stop doing this. But the plant knew that there was no consequences. And so as I'm dropping these plants, the plants start opening leaves. And of course, one of the comments that I receive often is like, but maybe the plant was just tired and it couldn't do it anymore. But then there are tests that we can do, which of course I did as part of the experiments. And so you present a disturbance that is totally new and it comes out of the blue, which is what would happen in the natural environment. You're habituated to something and then the fire alarm goes off. And the system must be, if it's not completely energetically exhausted, the system must be able to respond quickly, because this could be actually a real threat this time. And until you have more experience, again, you don't know. And that's exactly what Mimosa did in the lab. Is like, okay, I know that this drop is nothing to worry about, so I'm going to ignore it and I'm going to reopen my leaves and just keep in. And then this shake comes through just once, very brief and very strong. And suddenly the plant is like, wait a second, I don't know this, and I better just close my leaves just in case. And then you follow it immediately with the drop again. And as soon as the drop arrives again, the plant's like, this again? Seriously? I already know this. And so it takes no time. The plants reopen the leaves immediately and he ignores the drop instantly. So that tells me that not only the Mimosa is able to distinguish between a drop and shake, although they're both, and they were purposely chosen, so they're both mechanical disturbances, but they're not the same. So the plants can tell that. And then, of course, it can tell what is the value associated to these different experiences. So like the drop, I already learned through my experience that it means nothing really to worry about. While this other one, I don't have enough experience to make a decision and make a choice about what the consequences might be. So I better go safe. And of course, long story to get to the memory, but memory is part of the learning. So as I said, you can only do this if you remember the experience, your past, and I already encountered this and I don't have to worry about it. So I just wanted to know how long would Mimosa remember, the drop. And so initially I went back, so I left the plants undisturbed for a few days, and then I went back 3 days later. And I thought, these girls, actually, for me, they're girls. These girls don't remember. I bet they don't remember what the drop is, and instead they did as if I just did it. And so then I left them another 3 days. So this now it's like 6 days later, and still nothing. It's like they know exactly what the drop is. So then, all right, fine. I left them for a month. And not only that, but as part of the experiment, I had 2 different environments, one with lots of light available, where making mistakes of this kind is not as crucial, right? Because there is plenty of resources. The light is there. There is huge amount of it. If you lose an opportunity, that's okay. There is plenty more. But the other plants were in low light environments. And so there was enough light to survive and be okay. But if you make some of these mistakes, so if you close when it's not necessary, then you are actually really potentially compromising yourself. And you need to be a bit smarter with your choices or a bit quicker in your learning of what's going on around. And that's exactly what we see with mimosa. And when I left for a month, I divided them into groups. So some of the plants that were in the good environment ended up going into the low light, and vice versa. Some of the low light environment plants ended up in a good environment. And then a month later, I checked all of them. So the ones that were left in the environment where they received their original training, they continued to respond exactly as they did. The ones that were coming from a good environment and went to a crappy environment, suddenly were like, oh, I better learn quick here. And so their response was much faster than it used to be, just because the environment kind of demands it, that you are a bit smarter, because mistakes here are costly. But the interesting part to me was the fact that the plants that went from the low light environment to a high light environment, where you would think like, now you can relax. The environment is plentiful and there is no problem if you make a mistake. They don't relax. So it's almost like, not only I remember what the drop is, but I also remember now through my experience that the environment can change from good to bad to good to bad. And so I'm just going to keep, on a kind of alert kind of space where I don't waste any opportunity, even if I could relax, unless my experience of this environment really tells me that the bad news never come. And but obviously in this case, the plants was not happy to relax yet. And so there is, to me, this was highlighting not just the obvious, the plant remembers, it remembers after a month, but it remembers what it remembers. It remembers the drop, it remembers the environment change, it remembers in which direction the environment changed and what to do in relation to the drop based on what happened to the environment around it.
Yeah, it's not just, it's 2 layers of memory and also an awareness of where it is and where it used to be.
Yeah.
So it's, but here's the thing, where are those memories stored? That's why, as we, official science won't allow for that to actually molecularly exist inside a plant, but you have the research to show that it does.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is like this paper we was at forever. It was such a difficult one because it took almost 2 years to be published, and nobody of the journals would send it out for review, so it wouldn't even get a chance to be evaluated. And I think the reason why is because science, and I still get these kind of comments of like, but what is the mechanism? And it's like, how can I describe exactly? How can I describe the mechanism of something that we are just observing?
Yeah.
First, I don't know what the behavior is. If I don't know there is a behavior to be explored, why would I look for a mechanism? The mechanism could come, if you are interested, later. And so that was one of the main issues. And of course, because you highlight again the fact that we don't see plants, at least in mainstream science, we don't see plants as subject that are doing things. We see them as like in the dismembered version. So they're all about mechanism and what cells and what genes and what molecules are doing what. And it's like, I really don't care. What I care about is the fact that these plants, under this condition, which will be very similar, and they're designed pretty much to mimic the same condition and the same kind of question that we would ask if this was a rat or if it was a butterfly or if it was anything else. And the plant passes the test, so it's able to do something that we didn't expect it to do. It also, though, of course, and this is the part that I think is annoying for many people, for many colleagues probably, is the fact that, plants, of course, don't have neurons and they don't have brains. Great. Like, they're doing it anyway. So shouldn't we be even more excited of like, oh my God, so, I mean, having a brain and having neurons is amazing. And for us as humans, for example, it works fantastic. It makes us humans. We use it all the time, and this is how our system works, and how great. What a great evolutionary development, But this is not the end of the game. It's not that if you can only do certain things, you have particular structures, because this is what we're talking about. Brains and neurons are structures.
Mm-hmm.
So plants are just pointing, not only plants, but many other systems are pointing to the fact that these structures are not the only way in which these processes can be done and achieved and enriched. And behavior does not necessarily depend on the brain and the neural systems. And if anything, if we really want to understand our own brain and our own neural system, the place to look is at the base of our big, phylogenetic tree. Because in neuroscience, and even more generally in cognitive science, it's amazing. It's the only disciplines in science where instead of taking, which is what we normally do in the biologies, instead of taking the most ancient ancestor that we can find and then see how whatever structure that we're looking at has evolved through time, we decided to take the closest. The closest of course, kind of just highlight the little story, the end story of a structure. And in that process, we completely forgot that the evolutionary process doesn't invent anything, but is a tinkerer. So the evolution will tinker with structures and building blocks that are already in place. So the brain didn't suddenly appear, and the brain is not suddenly something special that never existed before. It existed before in a different form, and is using the same building blocks that other forms, much older, much more ancestral, are still using. And of course, plants, together with other systems like, some of the basal animals, and also, fungi, slime molds, and bacteria, those guys are all doing these, are all proficient with these processes and these behaviors. And yet, we are not even considering the fact that looking at them could give us keys to understanding ourselves better. How did we get here?
Yeah.
How did we get to this?
But
plants become annoying.
They do, but I mean mimosa is so cheeky in that way. I mean, it kind of breaks the brain or brain matter being the exclusive home of memory, but then that opens up everything else to. It doesn't mean brains can't hold memory or whatever. It just means that if you look further back up the story of life on the planet, you have to find earlier versions of things like situational awareness and memory, or else we wouldn't have got a brain. That's what happens.
Exactly. So it's actually, the brain-centric or the neurocentric view of the world as we have it at the moment. And, much of the studies of consciousness, for example, are automatically assuming that consciousness is in the brain.
Yeah.
And so, of course, plants automatically become not conscious, as with many other systems which don't have a brain. And it's but isn't that bias? Is you are already deciding, you're already deciding where this consciousness business is happening. And by default, you're already deciding that others don't have it, or that it's something that actually you are there to have. And I disagree that I don't think consciousness is something that you have, is not a property, but is the thing from which everything and all the properties do emerge.
Sure.
But, and that's the thing is this neurocentric view just cut us out from asking other questions. And when we do, of course, the system reacts because it doesn't want to, be disturbed. But said that, I have to say, the work with the peas for the Pavlovian learning, that was done with two neuroscientists, one at Oxford and the other one in Switzerland, in Zurich. So not all of them are like this, like the same with the plant physiologists, not all of them are just happy to dismember things. So, but when I talk about it, I'm saying the mainstream, the majority are thinking this way.
It's been my observation because I'm interested in this stuff professionally in an adjacent way. So I'm interested in how it where it impacts in archaeology and anthropology and so on, because it is the same problem. It's the problem with a reductionist materialist approach being the sole epistemology, and whilst it's a valid one, it's permanently incomplete, right? And so there's what I have found speaking to and publishing in this area is that individually, scientists in any field will be like, well, yeah, obviously. But it's, but you get them all together or expect them to speak publicly or publish, and then they all kind of revert to a company line. And what I find so frustrating about that is, like, individually, you guys don't follow this line, but you all get together and all of a sudden memories have to be in the brain, or what's the mechanism for memory in mimosa? And you go, guys, one-on-one, you do this. We can have an intelligent and speculative and enriching discussion, and then you all get together and nothing happens. Yeah,
and that's the thing. And of course, unfortunately, I would say this is because science is a product of colonialism, and colonialism, as we know, has particular agendas, and it wants to get to its targets, and so we are totally. It's interesting, like the colonial mind has colonized itself by restricting the scope of science in a way, by setting the rules of what is going to get funded, what is not going to get funded. And so much money are given to neuroscience, and so much money have been given to, neuroscience studies of the brain, to our consciousness. And do we know anything more than we did like 30, 40, 50 years ago, or even more? No, really. So maybe is it possible? Just the question is it possible we might be looking in the wrong place?
How many more times do we need to do this? Yes, I agree.
Exactly.
So, well, this seems to me, I mean, you must have thought about this yourself, but do you think the plants chose you for this particular mission because you are a behavioral ecologist, and it's one of those things, people aren't looking for behavior in plants because we don't think plants have behavior. So do you think you were summoned because you kind of think with an observation of animals in mind, and that's how you do things like drop these poor little plants in Florence, or all the kind of stuff that, and think behaviorally as if, which is correct. I mean, it's an organism with agency and is its own person. But do you think that's why you were summoned? Do you think they're like, okay, we need someone on the team who can recognize that we in fact have behaviors, because none of the people in the plant world are necessarily looking for it in the same sort of way?
I suspect this might be the case.
Yeah. I
know that, especially, with the plants that are the psychedelic plants, and also including the mushrooms in there, I have read plenty of reports of people that, I was a physicist and the plants gave me the download of all these physics, high level concepts that I couldn't get. And then suddenly, of course, the plants would have given me the high-level concept of physics. It wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. So the idea that they choose the right channels, which has already been primed in a way, to understand the information and put it in the right context, I think that, again, if we are going to be scientific about it, there's so many reports of this that it must be like happening quite often. And so it's not random. And and I suspect that the strength here was that I wasn't a plant biologist, so I wasn't looking at plants. Well, I wasn't looking at plants at all. So I wasn't looking at plants in any particular way. So I was kind of naive, and I was able to see what it was there. And of course, I wasn't completely naive because I was bringing the animal background with me, which gave me the tools, I think, to design experiments that many plant biologists wouldn't design. But said that there are plenty of colleagues who are doing incredible work. Most of them are ecologists. And I think that this is the big key, because the ecologists tend to be, first of all, they tend to spend a lot of time outside rather than inside a lab. And second, they're really interested in the relating of things rather than the breaking down of parts. And so I think the plants are very much, if I had to describe their mind, I would say that they have an ecological mind, in the sense that they are interested in allowing us to see more clearly the connections or the interrelatedness of everything. And so what a best place to go and pick on some ecologist who works on animals and doesn't know anything about plants. We can show whatever we want, and then we'll get it to work for us.
Yeah. Well, you got your revenge on the mimosa anyway.
Yeah. As I said, no plants were hurt in the process of these experiments.
No, you basically put them on a roller coaster, and like humans on a roller coaster, the first little dip is scary, and then you get used to it. That's basically what happened. You get little 15-centimeter bounces, and then you threw a snake at them. Like if you throw a snake at a human in a roller coaster, they'll get angry again or scared. But it was the most amazing. Like I was rapt. I think that it's a genius experiment, and it's such an animal behavior background experiment. It's sort of like how long, what can an organism put up with from a stress level perspective, and how long will it remember what stresses or potential threats are? That's something that zoologists have done for ages. And
exactly.
But you do that to plants, and all of a sudden, mimosa gets to teach us. Oh, by the way, memories exist outside of brain matter, so you're welcome.
I'm just doing it like that. Yeah, exactly.
Well, Monica, as I said, I love the book. It's absolutely in my wheelhouse. I think it's an amazing achievement, and thank you for sharing all the personal and inextricable parts of your journey that go on in exploring this idea of plant communication and interactivity. And for people who want to know more, and I'm sure they will by this point, where do they go to find out more about yourself and what you've got coming up and all that sort of thing?
I have obviously a website, which is justmyname.com. They can find me because I'm now based at the University of Sydney, and so they can find me there. I guess the book can be found pretty much anywhere online, the usual suspects, directly from the publisher. But here in Australia, there are a few bookshops that are having a few copies. I think that it's one of those like, who is this anyway? And there are copies around, so many. Right? And I do I try to participate as much as I can and as much time as I can manage into various events where there's direct connection with the general audience, the general public, because I really love that. And so whenever I can, I have books with me, and you're welcome to come join us and come and have a chat, because that's one thing that I can assure you. If you come to one of these events, I will take my 2-3 hours to sign books, and not because I'm selling so many, but because I don't see why anybody would want to scribble on their book unless they are actually having a chat and feeling the person in front of them and the person in front of them to feel them. And so I really enjoy that. So if you are interested, do come and chat with me.
Wonderful. And of course, all this information will be in the show notes for people listening. And Monica, thanks for this amazing chat. Again, it's such a good book.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, and thank you for allowing me to wander off in all sorts of strange directions and to then return to the beginning.
Probably you can tell from our chat what was so appealing to me about Thus Spoke the Plant. There are really only a handful of, shall we say, post-Cartesian books written by scientists that manage to thread the needle between retaining empirical rigor and operating in an animate universe. Experiences with plant spirits, when described in this sort of context, are often called subjective, which they definitionally are, but it's commonly done in such a way as to make them safe or palatable for their assumed readership. Dr. Gagliano both uses and brings trouble to the term subjective, but I think the stroke of genius in her book is showing what a correctly deployed use of the subjective looks like in full flight. Monica explores the subjective or imaginal or spirit realm, or whatever you want to call it, and then both responds to and seeks, I guess, verification of these encounters in empirical contexts in the waking world. And the book is about doing that and also writing the book because, of course, she can only ever be a subject herself. So check out the show notes for more information about Thus Spoke the Plant, Monica's website, a keynote she gave recently, all that sort of thing. This is one to definitely let me know your thoughts on and possibly share with the intransigent materialists in your life. So subscribe, share, do the things. You know how it goes. And as always, find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.